Hey y'all, my name is Cassie and I am the creator of Pieces of Scrap. In today's video, we're going to be doing another free amigurumi pattern review video, and all of these patterns will be either fall/autumn related or Halloween related patterns. So first off, I always like to go over the criteria that I use to rate patterns. So number one is, would I use the pattern again? This really comes down to how easy it is to understand, if you can work through it really quickly and make a bunch of plushies from that pattern, and so on and so forth. Number two is, can I understand the pattern easily? This really comes down to if there are thorough instructions and detailed instructions that don't leave you guessing or give you any questions, as well as work in progress photos to show you what your work should look like during different steps in the pattern. And in addition, any diagrams that might be useful in showing what you're doing in certain steps that might be more complicated. All of those things make really great and easy to follow patterns. Then finally, number three is, do I like the finished product? And this always comes down to if it's a case of expectations versus reality, where the photos of the pattern on the pattern post don't necessarily look like what your plushie turns out looking like when you've finished it. I always like to start my videos off with a follower suggestion. So this pattern was suggested to me by Crochet by JJ the Boss. It is Franken-Hello Kitty, and this is a pattern by Dolly Crochet Shop MK. It's a fairly high sewing project. The things that you create without sewing are, you have two legs and you also have, I believe the head is worked separately from the body. So you create the legs and the body together, create the arms separately, the ears separately, head separately. You also have to create all these little bits on the face, so the little screws on the side of the Frankenstein head, as well as the bow and the middle of the bow. The bow is two pieces. The skirt of this plushie is actually crocheted into loops that you leave open. So you crochet into the front loops or back loops. I think it was the back loops to leave the front loops open, and then you can create the skirt off of those front loops later in the pattern. First thing to notice in this pattern is, for the head instructions, it doesn't tell you to sew the head closed, but in the pictures there's no yarn tail or anything, so I'm pretty sure you're supposed to sew that head closed so that there's not an open hole with stuffing at the bottom of the head. The next thing that I noticed was that there were some color changes that were notated in different colors than what the pattern designer used in the photos. So in the photos, the pattern designer uses a different color than what it says in the pattern. In the pattern, it tells you to make them in black, which is similar to what the inspiration photo calls for, but throughout the rest of the pattern, it refers to different colors that don't refer back to that inspiration photo, but rather they refer to the colors that the designer chose to use when they made it. The next thing that I wanted to note was that the pattern designer uses felt to put the eyes on the plushie instead of safety eyes, but when you add the eyes to the plushie, it doesn't give you a row number where you should place your safety eyes. It also doesn't give you a row number for where you're gluing on your felt eyes. It just tells you to glue them on where it looks right, from what I remember. So I ended up embroidering my eyes on to get that more oval shaped eye instead of a very round safety eye, because of course I don't have any oval safety eyes. I really need to get my hands on some, so I'm gonna have to order some in the future. I like the ones that have like little sparkles on the eyes. Those are really cute, and just some plain oval ones, so those would be awesome. But it's always nice to also have some plushies that don't have safety eyes in case somebody's giving this to a baby or something like that, so it's a little bit safer. Anyway, I embroidered my eyes on, and I just used amigurumi needles to figure out where I was going to place them, and then I ended up sewing them on so that the placement was correct and it looked good. But really I went by off of the photos to kind of determine how far apart they would be, and also just kind of my discretion as well to determine what rows I was going to place those on. There were lots of clarifying diagrams throughout the pattern that made it a little bit easier to figure out what you were supposed to be doing, so that is always a plus when you come across a pattern. But the assembly page the instructions were very vague. I appreciate that there was a photo on the assembly page to show you where things should be on the face, but the big thing is it was just very vague instructions. You didn't get row numbers or how many spaces in between things should be. So specifically for like the screws on the side of the head, I'm pretty sure it just told you to place them under the ears, but then the ear instructions, it just tells you to place them where they look right, I think is what it said. So it's just kind of difficult to get that right every single time if you don't have a specific instruction telling you what row to place things on. Overall, I think this is really cute and it's really unique, and I'm sure it will be really popular. Hello Kitty has just been going crazy in popularity recently again, so I think this will do well at markets, and it makes a cute pattern. It is a little bit longer of a make because of all the sewing involved, but I think it's worth the product that you get at the end, and so I would rate this pattern 4 stars out of 5. It could do with some extra details and instructions to make things a little bit clearer, but I think overall I got pretty much what the photo looks like. The next pattern I reviewed for this video is Kenny the Pumpkin Frog. This is a pattern by kelvencrochets. This is another pattern that was kind of higher sew than I expected. I expected all of the little arms and legs on this frog, as well as like the eye bobbles, to actually be bobbles and not be separate pieces that you have to crochet and then sew on. However, I was incorrect in that assumption. All of these pieces that you see here, you have to crochet separately and sew on separately. So you have to create 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, as well as the head, the pumpkin cap, and the stem, and the pumpkin. They are all separate pieces. None of them are crocheted together to make one piece, which was a bit of a letdown because upon seeing the photos, I was expecting the pumpkin to be a typical round shape, and then you would decrease and then increase to create the head in the head color. And then after that, I was expecting that the cap would also be a part of that, just a color change, and maybe the stem would be just like crocheted off of the little pumpkin cap here, but that was not the case. I think the pattern could do with some tweaking to make it less sewing, especially nowadays. A lot of people won't click on your pattern if it's not no sew or low sew. People just don't really want to waste their time on a pattern that you have to sew a lot of pieces together, unless it's like a really visually captivating pattern like a dragon or a Loch Ness monster, something of that sort. But for a project like this that looks like it should be a lot simpler than it actually is, I don't think people would gravitate towards this one just because of all the sewing involved. I also noticed that the pattern cover photo of this was done in a fuzzy, more furry yarn, but the pattern photos themselves were done in acrylic yarn, which was surprising to me. So I was expecting this to be pretty easy, considering the cover photo of the pattern had similar textured yarn. However, I had to eliminate several rows from the body of the pumpkin to make it a little bit shorter and make it just overall smaller. So because I made this in Bernat blanket, I decided that 21 rows was too many for the pumpkin. It would have been too tall, so I ended up stopping the repeat of just single crochets at row 15, and then I skipped to row 22 and started doing those decreases and continued as normal from there. So I eliminated quite a few rows of plain single crochets to make the pumpkin overall shorter. So another thing that I noticed, because I was working in Bernat blanket instead of acrylic yarn like the pattern designer did in the work in progress photos and throughout the pattern, the limbs and the eyes, those pieces were all a little bit longer than I wanted them to be in Bernat, so I ended up eliminating 1 row from all of those to make them a little shorter. And another thing that I noticed was the cover photo is like ideally what I would want this project to look like when it's finished. It looks cute, kind of simple. I was a little thrown off when I got to the assembly page and saw that the arms and legs were like this much in length instead of being like little tiny baubles like we have here. And it was just a little weird for me. I feel like it was a little bit catfishy to have that photo at the beginning of the pattern showing those dainty little arms and legs, but then when you go into the pattern, it's acrylic that you're working with. So overall, I think the pattern is really cute. There were really great pictures on the assembly page to kind of show you what things are supposed to look like and where things should be placed, which I always give kudos for because the assembly page is what I think is the most important page when it comes to showing pictures so that you know where things should be placed. So with all of that being said, I would give this pattern 3.5 stars out of 5. It's really cute. I just wish that there were a little bit more thought put into the pattern to make it a little less sewing. The next pattern I reviewed for this video is Spice the Pumpkin Pie Turtle, and this pattern is a pattern by river.lily.crochet, and it's a fairly well involved pattern. If you're familiar at all with the Crochet by Jenna turtles, it is worked up very similarly. There's a little bit of sewing involved. So you make your head, you make all of the fins. The 2 front fins are bigger than the back 2 fins. And for the body, you create that from the shell top to the bottom. And then the tail is actually crocheted off of the body. You don't have to crochet that separately and sew it on. You leave gaps for all of the fins, and I believe you don't leave a gap for the head. And then you have to sew those things on later. You also have to create the little whipped cream topper and sew that on as well separately. My first real note about this pattern is that I wish there was a photo somewhere in the pattern of the face head on instead of on the side so that you could really see where the eyes should be placed and how many stitches should be between them, because the instruction in the pattern, it seemed like there might have been too many stitches in between the eyes. And so I think I opted for putting my eyes a little bit closer from what the pattern calls for you to do. And that was just so that you don't just have to look at this turtle from a side to see that it has 2 eyes. This was important because it was missing a stitch count between the eyes. They seemed too far apart when you place them between rows 5 and 6, so I ended up placing mine between rows 5 and 4, so just 1 row closer, but it would have been nice to get like a gauge of how much space should be in between the eyes. The next thing that I noticed was just that I have never seen double crochet abbreviated as DBC before. I get where the pattern designer was coming from, but I think to eliminate any confusion, you should kind of try to go with whatever the normal abbreviation for common stitches like that is, so that you don't create any confusion or make people think that there's a stitch missing from your stitch abbreviations list that may be different from a double crochet. The next thing that I noticed in the pattern was that there's just some consistency errors about how some things were written. So for example, in row 13 of the body, it says to treble crochet, double crochet, and half double crochet into the first stitch front loop. The way this is written is different from all other cases where we're supposed to crochet into the front loop. Everywhere else, the instruction to make all of those stitches in the front loop usually comes before, and if the stitches are made into the same stitch, I think they should be in brackets as well. So making sure it's consistent throughout the pattern is really important, because if it's written one way in one circumstance and then it's written differently in a different part of the pattern, it may cause some confusion, because in a lot of cases, when something's written in a different order, it means something completely different than it would earlier in the pattern when it was written in whatever order it was before. So the confusion in this circumstance, it kind of seemed like you were just supposed to crochet 1 stitch into a front loop instead of all of the stitches that are grouped into that area into the same front loop and then continue on from there. That's why I think it's really important to have brackets or parentheses, anything of that sort, to kind of group the things that are going to be put into the same stitch, as well as just keeping it consistent where you put that instruction about putting things in a front loop or back loop, whether it is before that bracket or if it's after. The next thing that I noticed was about stitch counts. Specifically starting in row 12, the stitch count acts as if the 3 stitches we made together in one stitch to form the tail doesn't count in the stitch count. If it did, the stitch count would be 62 instead of 60. And this was super confusing to me because in row 13, the stitch count is 60 again instead of 62. Even though here we add another 2 stitches to the row count by crocheting the other half of the tail into one stitch. Row 13 is especially confusing because at the end of the row, I had 3 unworked stitches, if you didn't count the tail as stitches, plus 1 open back loop from the first half of the tail. So that row was really confusing, and I didn't see a note in the description or anything of that sort telling us that there's a correction for those areas. And lastly, the whipped cream instruction was pretty confusing. Specifically in row 2, it says in parentheses, 3 half double crochet, 2 half double crochet. And the way that it's written doesn't really show you where the increase is supposed to be, especially since there wasn't a stitch count at the end of that row. The way that this was written was different from the rest of the pattern because the increases were specifically noted as such in the rest of the pattern. I settled on making 3 half double crochet in one stitch and then 2 half double crochet in the next stitch. And that seemed like the correct way to read this pattern because at the end of the row, I had the correct amount of stitches. So overall, there was a little bit of confusion near the end of the pattern, but that isn't a huge deal as long as you're able to work out what you're supposed to do. But I could see that being a problem in the future if I ever had like a commission for this kind of thing, or I was making more for markets or anything of that sort. It might cause a stumbling block kind of issue where I'm not sure what I did the last time to get through that error and make sure it was correct the next time. So anyway, I would give this pattern 3 stars out of 5. It makes a really cute little pumpkin pie turtle. However, there's just some issues in the pattern itself that need to be resolved before I could rate it higher. The next pattern I reviewed for this video is the Giant Pumpkin by Catnit, and I've been wanting to do this pattern for about a year now, but I really just needed to get enough materials to do it. Since it is a bigger pattern, I used about a skein and a half of this main body color to make the pumpkin, and then for the stem you have to use a pretty significant amount of yarn as well. The first thing I noticed about this pattern was actually on the materials page. It tells you that you should be working with 3 different colors, but I only saw 2 visible colors in the pattern, so it was a little confusing about what that 3rd color was supposed to be for. Later on in the pattern, I realized that that 3rd color was used for sewing and embroidering, specifically creating the sections of the pumpkin. However, I don't know why that would be necessary unless you want to call out those sections a little bit more and have that area where the sections are created a little bit more obvious so that there would be a line there or something like that. But I haven't seen that in a lot of pumpkin patterns, but it's completely fine if that's what the pattern designer wanted. However, I just don't think it's necessary. I want the sections on my pumpkin to look a little bit more seamless than that. Next, the instruction to sew the sides together was a little bit vague. If I was crocheting a pumpkin for the first time and this was the first pattern that I would be using, I wouldn't be sure if I was supposed to sew the long sides together or the short sides together. It does say in the next instruction that you should have a tube, but either way you would have a tube in that circumstance. It just would really come down to what shape that tube would be, if it would be a long skinny tube or if it would be more of a rounded circle-shaped tube. I thought all the diagrams in the pattern were super helpful, especially if you were making a pumpkin for the first time. They're really helpful in trying to determine what things should be looking like throughout the pattern. However, I still think the pattern could benefit from some work in progress photos so that you could see what those different steps look like when they're finished. Anyway, I thought this pattern was really cute, and I'm pretty sure this will make some really cute fall decor. So anyway, I would give this pattern 4 stars out of 5. The next pattern I reviewed for this video is the Lanky Klown. This is a pattern by Katie Crochet 0603, and I was actually so surprised that this was a free pattern because a lot of patterns like this don't end up being free, having them be like big, more like decor type patterns. I guess it's a little bit of a simple pattern because it's just a tube with legs and arms crocheted into it and then a circle with obviously some frills to make it look a little bit more like a clown. It is a pretty simple pattern, but typically you would see this kind of pattern being sold in a store. So I was really thrilled when I was able to make this pattern for free and test it for you guys. And I just love how it came out. It's so cute, and I think it's going to be really popular at markets. My first note is just that the color changes weren't always noted. And what I mean by color changes were just when you made different pieces of the pattern where you were not crocheting and then you would color change in the row, rather you're starting a new piece of the pattern and you have to crochet it separately, it wouldn't tell you what color you're supposed to be starting in to create that piece. And I get to a certain extent that the colors of this pattern for each piece will really come down to what you want it to look like, and there are some variations of what the pattern can come out looking like. However, I think having just like a base terminology of like this should be in color A and this should be in color B and this should be in color C and so on would be a little bit more helpful, because I found myself continually going back to the cover page to look at what I wanted mine to look like to determine what color I should be using for that part of the pattern. The next thing that I was kind of bummed about was that there's no pictures on the assembly page. I always think that having pictures on your assembly page is the most important place you should put pictures on your pattern, just so that you don't have to flip through the pages and look through the cover page over and over again to figure out where things should be if the instructions aren't detailed enough for you to figure that out without looking. But I always like to look at pictures as I assemble a pattern just so that I have a visual reference and I'm double checking my work as I sew it on so that I don't have any weird looking plushies because I wasn't referring to a photo. Lastly, I really love all the customization options for this pattern. You can make it without the frill, you can make the hat in certain different ways, you can put the spots in different places, you can choose to do different color changes wherever you want in the pattern, as well as just the colors that you can pick to make your clown can either make it turn out looking like Pennywise or another evil clown, or just like a silly little circus clown that might be a little bit more lighthearted like mine is. And so with that, I would give this pattern 4 stars out of 5. It's another great pattern to work with for this Halloween season. So the next pattern I reviewed for this video is Robbee Zombie, and this is a pattern by Low Bug Down with the Stitches. I really like how this turned out, and I specifically really love the pattern photos for the cover image of this pattern, specifically just because of those eyes on there. I really think that eyes really make a plushie, especially those big, beautiful, custom-made eyes like in her photo. And so my first kind of note is just that I'm kind of disappointed with what the eyes look like on mine. I wish that my eye was much bigger, and that I actually just chose a regular black safety eye that was bigger and more comparable to what I ended up embroidering for the eye that is lost on this plushie. I think it would have looked a little better. I actually tried to pull my safety eye out several times, but the washers on these sparkly safety eyes are just not as forgiving as they are on the regular black safety eyes that I usually use. You can't really pry this thing off. It's just like stuck in there, so I couldn't go back on my decision and pick a different kind of safety eye here, but I still think it looks really cute. But anyway, I'll give you kind of like a 360 look at this guy. He's got a little scar on his butt, and he's got the missing eye on the front, and he also has 6 little legs under there. And I love the way that this color change was placed on the plushie because it kind of disguises it, because it's like right in line with that first leg, so you can't really tell that it's there upon first glance. The only real note that I have about this pattern is actually about the wings. The way that you attach them together is no-sew. You're supposed to single crochet them together, but when I did that, there was quite a bit of a seam that was going to stick out vertically and not lay flat, and so I ended up just slip stitching them together. I slip stitched through the front loop of the wing facing me and the back loop of the wing that was farther away from me to create a more seamless finish. And then kind of afterwards, I realized that I'm going to be sewing it to the bee anyway, so I didn't really have to do that. I could have sewed down that seam that's created in the pattern. So it's not a huge deal. I just wanted it to be a little less obvious that there was a seam sticking up vertically in between those wings. But anyway, I really liked this pattern. It's super easy to make. Bees are always super easy to make. They're like the most simple amigurumi pattern that you could ever come up with, and that's why there's so many bee patterns out there, but I always love finding one that's unique, and this one is one of those really unique ones that I think people will really like, especially since bees are so popular. That's also why there's so many patterns for them. But that being said, I would give this pattern 4.5 stars out of 5. The next pattern that I reviewed for this video is Ghost in a Pumpkin. This is a pattern by Tinkering Crochet, and this is actually the no sewing-esque pattern that I was looking for when I started making the frog in a pumpkin pattern. So this is really what ideally this pattern should be. Whenever you have like a whatever coming out of a pumpkin, I think this is the example that you should take if you're making a pattern like this in the future. This pattern is completely no-sew. You create the pattern from the stem to the ghost to the pumpkin itself, and then you sew those sections onto the pumpkin later. And I think that is partially the disconnect between these two patterns, is just that I wonder if the pattern designer didn't think it was possible to create those sections without having to create the pumpkins separately. But really, when you're creating a pumpkin like this, and there's nothing at the top, obviously, so maybe I'll hold this one as an example. When you're creating a pumpkin like this, you don't have the stem on it, you're just sewing through the center of the pumpkin to the bottom center of the pumpkin to create those sections. The way that it's different in this pattern is that once you are doing those sections, you have the ghost on top already, obviously. So you just sew through the bottom, so your yarn would be coming out of the bottom of the pumpkin, and then you just have to insert it to the side of this ghost and through the bottom to the center again, and just keep repeating that until you have the desired amount of sections that you want. So that's, I think, how you would make this a little less no-sew, is just to follow this pattern as an example. Anyway, the pattern instructions were super clear and easy to follow. There's lots of photos, and it was super easy to understand what was being done and where things should go and all sorts of things like that. This pattern, I really didn't have any notes about. It was super easy to follow. I loved it, and I would give this pattern 5 stars out of 5. The last pattern I reviewed for this video is the Western Ghost, and this is a pattern by Happy Hooks Crochet Co. And from what I understand about this pattern, it was a pattern that was quickly thrown together without any testers or anything of that sort. It was written using rough notes, so I don't think it was thoroughly tested before it was put out. Another thing that I'm going to note is that she makes hers in acrylic yarn instead of blanket or chenille yarn, so that is one of the main differences between the two of ours. The first thing that I'm going to note about this pattern is that in row 22, I think you're meant to crochet into the back loops only of row 21, but it doesn't say that. It just says to crochet into the back loops, but it doesn't designate a row to crochet into. The next thing that I noticed was that whenever there's a repeat in the pattern, there isn't parentheses around the thing that you're supposed to repeat, so it's a little bit confusing. And then the next thing that I noticed was that it doesn't tell you how many stitches should be in between the eyes, so I ended up putting 5 visible stitches in between my eyes just because I was looking at the photo and that's how many she had in between her eyes. The next notes I have about this pattern are specifically about the hat alone. You crochet the hat separately, and I sewed mine on, but I don't think you're supposed to sew it on. It just wasn't fitting on there the way that I wanted to, so I ended up just sewing it on so I don't lose the hat when I'm transporting it to markets, as well as just making sure it's in the perfect position all the time. So in row 2 of the hat, it says to single crochet increase 6 times, but there's no other type of increase in the pattern. It's only ever a single crochet increase, so I'm not sure why she put single crochet increase 6 times in the pattern. It's a little confusing, and it could also be misinterpreted as 1 single crochet in 1 stitch and then a increase in the next stitch, and to repeat that 6 times. However, I know that it's supposed to be increase 6 times in this row because the stitch count says 12. In round 16, I also noticed that it says back loops only, but it doesn't tell you what you're doing in the back loops only, which was a little confusing. I ended up just doing single crochets in the back loops only. The next notes that I have about the pattern are about the cactus and the pot that it's in. You make those 2 pieces separately. However, there's no instructions to fasten off or sew closed or anything like that when you're making those. It just gives you the instructions about what to do in the rows, but never to fasten off. There's a couple more things I want to note about this pattern. I do understand that it's a rough draft of a pattern is what this pattern was written from, but I really think some time should have been put in to just perfect it and make it as clear as possible before releasing it so that people wouldn't have to come to the pattern designer with questions, especially since there were a lot of areas in the pattern where it was just a little bit questionable and it could be confusing to beginner crocheters. I really think that there should be photos throughout the pattern, and especially on the assembly page. There isn't really an assembly page, it just tells you what to do after you make some of the pieces of the ghost. So for example, after you create these little arms, it tells you to sew them in line with the blush. And the big thing about that instruction about sewing the arms in line with the blush was when I was looking at the photos of the finished pattern on the cover page, the arms are not really in line with the blush. They're like outside of the blush. And so that was kind of confusing, and I'm not sure where that instruction came from. Anyway, I think this pattern is really cute and it makes a really adorable little Western ghost. I think this will be really popular, especially where I'm located at markets. And I would give this pattern 3 stars out of 5. So there you have it, another Halloween / fall themed amigurumi pattern review video in the books, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you hit that thumbs up button and leave a comment down below which one of these patterns you think you're gonna try. And if you've ever tried any of them prior to seeing this video, also let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. And with that, I hope to see you guys in my next video. Bye!